today my presentation is about autism and emotions, and more specifically how people with autism access their own emotional states or relate to their emotional experiences. So my purpose is to try to show that they are characterized by particularities of access to their emotional experiences. And to show that, I will first talk about emotions in autism, and more specifically emotional deficits that have been the object of scientific inquiry in recent years. Then I'll explain the notion of access in emotional processes and try to compare it with the notion of consciousness, emotional consciousness, which is in general more used in the literature. And then I will explain the deficit or hypothetical particularities of emotional access in autism. So, autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it has been considered as a spectrum for over a decade in research, and has been characterized as such by the DSM-5. I will talk a bit about the DSM-5, but won't go deep into details or criticisms, but there are a lot of criticisms that can be made. Just to explain briefly, so the new diagnostic criteria imply two broad dimensions of symptoms. So people with autism are characterized by deficits in social communication and restricted and fixated interests. And current research suggests that according to, or considering the heterogeneity of the spectrum, we shouldn't look for a unified explanation of autism, but rather we should try to look for which is called endophenotypes, so more precise phenotypes or particularities, and try to understand how it works, and we would have like smaller, more precise and better defined deficits in that way. And so I'm interested in the emotional processes. And so according to the DSM-5, emotional particularities are one of the symptoms of social communication problems. So deficits in social emotional reciprocity, sharing of interests, emotions, or affect. But people with autism also show particularities in their sensory abilities, and those are a part of the restricted and fixated interests, and I think that can be linked with emotional difficulties because they can react very emotionally to them. And so, in recent years, researchers studying the nature of emotional deficits have discovered that people with autism have deficits in emotional recognition. They have higher levels of negative emotions than positive emotions compared with neurotypical people. They also have a certain social anxiety and difficulties in emotion regulation. Some others talk about irritability, poor anger control, temper tantrums, self-injurious behavior, aggression, and mood dysregulation. So it seems to be like that there is a big set of emotional deficits in ASD. But if we want to study endophenotypes, we have to look for more precise deficits, and it seems that there is, they're also overwhelmed by sensation. So it seems that there is something happening with the way they relate to their emotions. In fact, they show important degrees of alexithymia, difficulties in emotional understanding, emotional consciousness, and I'll be back to that notion, emotional awareness. It's hard for them to describe their own feelings and feelings of others, and to labeling their own emotions. So I'll try to give a definition or at least a plausible explanation of this deficit. as being a set of particularities of emotional access.
Sorry, what is Alexa?
It's difficulties in like so understanding and feeling your own emotions, and I think it's tested by like verbal reports. So it's not clear if it's a difficulty to express an emotion or to refer to that emotion. So if we want to understand how we can relate to our emotions, I think that we can make at least a conceptual distinction between emotions themselves and emotional access or access to our emotions. What emotions are is, of course, a heavily debated question, but I will here give a set of characteristics that are implied in emotional processes to compare emotions with emotional access. So here this woman is afraid because a man is going to kill her in her shower. So she has a set of physiological modifications, some specific neural activations, maybe action tendencies. Here she's screaming, but she could also have run or passed out. Emotions are directed toward a particular object. Here it would be the man with the knife. But also we can talk about formal object, as Mary explained earlier. And here it would be maybe the dangerousness, but it's, yeah, maybe we can talk about that, I don't know. And emotions also imply phenomenology, so what it is like to feel this emotion. And here it would be a very negative and intense feeling. So here she can feel fear without really relate to her fear or approaching her fear in a way. So how could she like access this emotion? And here we have different terms in the literature to refer to that process. So some authors talk about introspections, some about awareness, comprehension, understanding, and consciousness. And consciousness is the most used term in the literature. So what is consciousness? I won't really answer that question, but when we look at current research about what it is, it seems to have, I suggest that there is two incompatible intuitions, at least if we want to apply that to the literature on emotions. We can divide the theories of consciousness in two very different ways of understanding it. So there would be the cognitive theories and the non-cognitive theories. I don't really like this terminology because it's not clear that non-cognitive theories see consciousness as totally out of cognitive processes. But broadly explained, cognitive theories consider consciousness as a set of cognitive functions. So it would be a global broadcasting. So when a set of global neuronal activations is here, the subject can become conscious. And non-cognitive theories, they will say that the consciousness is the experience itself, so the phenomenology or the feeling, what it is like for the subject, and it doesn't imply this global broadcasting. So, yeah, there are different kind of theories, and I don't think I have time to go deep into details here, but we can come back to that if you want after. What is important to see here is that the cognitive theories make a relation between consciousness and cognition, and the non-cognitive theories will say that consciousness is the phenomenology, so what it is like to have an experience. And when we try to apply this terminology to the emotional processes, it seems very difficult to describe properly the relation that one has to her emotion, because different researchers on emotions have tried to define the notion of emotional consciousness using one or the other theory that I just described. And for example, Challenge says that emotional consciousness is affective valence. Prince has this way of seeing the emotional consciousness as a feeling. So when the emotion becomes conscious, it's because we have the perception of the bodily changes, and he calls that a feeling. According to Barrett, emotional consciousness would be the emotional experience which is perceived. So when the core effects of this state, which has a valence and an intensity, becomes available to categorization and conceptualization, the subject becomes conscious. And according to Barrett and Winkelmann, it would be what it is like, so just the valence, the feeling of pleasure or displeasure. And some other authors said that emotional consciousness is like evaluations that can be associational or computational, so more or less direct and automatic. What I want to say here is that we can see that some of these conceptions designate emotional consciousness as being an affective feeling, and others as being cognitive processes related to the emotional state. And the problem is that it leads to an incompatibility, because if we want to know what an unconscious emotion would be, we are facing two definitions that designate two very different processes. And yeah, we can understand an unconscious emotion as being an emotion without any phenomenology or affective feeling, or according to others, we can understand it as having this phenomenology, but the emotion wouldn't be cognitively processed by the subject. So, for example, she or he wouldn't pay attention to this emotion. So, I think we need an account that is compatible with emotion, and if we go back to that notion of access, I think it allows us to make distinctions that capture the different way of referring to one's own emotions, and it will allow us understanding the particularities in those processes in autism. So I will use Bloch's terminology here to differentiate two types of access. Phenomenal access, sorry, it's weird that it does that, but the L was on the right. And so the phenomenal access, according to Bloch, is consciousness, but according to cognitive theories, or Johan, for example, it wouldn't be consciousness. So that's why I don't put the word consciousness here, but we can relate to that if we want. So there is a phenomenal access and a cognitive access. And so the phenomenal access can be understood as being, so according to Rosenthal, it would be the phenomenality, so the what it is like, plus a subjectivity. So it's a weird distinction that he makes, but so according to Bloch, first, it's the what it is like for a subject to have an experience. And Rosenthal says, yeah, okay, this is the phenomenology, but then when it's subjectively processed, it becomes a phenomenal, access in a way. And so this is distinct from the cognitive axis, and Bloch explains, so a representation is access conscious, but now he doesn't use the word conscious in that definition anymore. But anyway, if it is made available to cognitive processing. So the advantage of the notion of access is that we can have a phenomenal access to our emotions or a cognitive access to them, and I think that those are compatible. And I don't know if it's a difference of nature or of degrees, but we can have one or the other. And let's see now what would designate these two types of access in emotional theories, so what it would mean for emotional researchers. So according to Barrett, there is something like the affective information or the core affective state linked to ongoing automatic evaluations or primary appraisals of the world. And this is a way to relate, according to her, to our own emotions. And if we apply the terminology that I just explained, it is the phenomenal access to our affective state. And she also talks about categorization of the core affect with conceptual knowledge, and this is the cognitive access in the words I used. Russell also talks about this way to relate to our emotional state, which is it would be so implicit states that would be peripheral, preconscious, and this can be understood as the phenomenal access. And he also says that when the phenomenal experience is processed, it can be brought to awareness through attention to the subject, and this would be the cognitive access. And Lambie and Marcel make a more clear distinction between what they call the phenomenal experience without awareness, the implicit self, and that would be the phenomenal access, and what they call awareness or explicit self, which would be the cognitive access. So phenomenal access is automatic, fast, implicit, and if we in dual process theories, it designates the system 1, and the cognitive access is controlled, slow, and explicit, and it designates the system 2. So now we can explain the deficit or the particularities of access in autism. First, people with autism can definitely feel emotions. They are sensitive to others' distress. There is a presence of affective empathy, or what is also called emotional empathy, and they would even have a heightened emotional empathy than neurotypical people. So they absolutely don't lack emotions themselves or feelings. But then with the access, so neurotypical people understand their emotion very intuitively, in an automatic, subjective, implicit manner, and most generally, so using this system 1 way, whereas people with autism relate to their emotions thanks to analytic, controlled, objective, and explicit process. So they tend to use a system 2. So in light of the terminology that I just described, we can say that neurotypical people would use generally more phenomenal access to relate to their emotional states, and autistic people would tend to need the cognitive access to relate to their affective state. And we can find more hints or explanations in recent studies. Hill and colleagues claim that autistic people show concrete thought patterns, that is, a tendency to focus on external events rather than inner experiences. So they would use a cognitive access rather than a phenomenal one. Others say that they are impaired in the awareness of one's own emotions, that they use atypical cognitive strategy to gain access to their own emotional state in response to other people's emotions. And Bigger and colleagues explain that children with high-functioning autism would have a deviant emotional display rule understanding. So display rules would be norms about how one should express emotions. And in the study they conducted, they showed that people with autism more often reported prototypical scripts rather than specific personal experiences. So they accessed them cognitively, but not subjectively. And in a recent study, Nask and colleagues talk about emotion processing difference in autism requiring consciousness and more time. So they would use the system 2, which is unusual according to the authors, because neurotypical people would use more the system 1. And we could also wonder if it would be the same kind of access for others' emotions, because people with autism have difficulties in emotion recognition, deficits in social interactions. Some authors talk about inability to perceive emotional signals in others, and yeah, that makes sense because those signals are in general processed very automatically and fastly. They also have particularities with cognitive empathy, and Sileni and colleagues talk about alexithymia and lack of empathy, which would be correlated, indicating a link between understanding one's own and others' emotions. But it's still an open question if there is a link or a causal relationship between those processes. Well, in conclusion, I have said that there are some problems with the notion of consciousness for emotional processes, and I made that distinction between emotions themselves and emotional access to show that the notion of emotional access may be more useful than the one of consciousness, and that we can distinguish two types of access that are not incompatible. And I have talked briefly about particularities in emotional access in autism. I had some questions, but thank you.